Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal have started to call my plan Bidenomics. Initially, I don't think they meant it with a great deal of respect. With all due respect toward them, our plan is working.
Bidenomics is working.
That's Bidenomics in action. And the American people are beginning to feel Bidenomics.
That's the American dream. That's Bidenomics.
And Bidenomics is working.
And guess what? Bidenomics is working.
Welcome to Breaking Bidenomics with Josh Hammer, presented by Birch Gold. So we'll be with you for the next hour breaking down Bidenomics. As you can hear there, Joe Biden is running his 2024 re-election campaign primarily, it seems, on the issue of so-called Bidenomics. In fact, just this past Thursday evening, the NFL had their season opener in Kansas City, and the Biden 2024 re-election campaign, which up until now was basically just a basement campaign, they have their first kind of sweeping national ad buy. They decided to make it on this issue, on Bidenomics. Here's this ad that they titled, "Got to Work."
They said millions would lose their jobs and the economy would collapse. But this president refused to let that happen. Instead, he got to work, fixing supply chains, fighting corporate greed, passing laws to lower the cost of medicine, cut utility bills, and make us more energy independent. Today, inflation is down to 3%, unemployment the lowest in decades. There's more to do, but President Biden is getting results that matter.
I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
Let's be very clear. This is gaslighting on stilts. They are asking the American people, they are asking us not to believe our own lying eyes. They are trying to offer up a turd sandwich, convince you that it is a tasty filet mignon, and that if you squint just hard enough, then you will actually see that this man, the doddering dolt from Delaware, the octogenarian Joseph R. Biden himself, has actually been a Reagan-esque figure when it comes to the economy. It's not going to work, folks. The American people will see right through this ruse. Let's start to actually break down a little bit what Bidenomics actually means, as opposed to the gaslighting version that the Biden 2024 re-election campaign is trying to sell you on. So, for starters, we actually learned just this past week, per the Committee for Fiscal Responsibility, that the national deficit this year is literally going to double from approximately $1 trillion to $2 trillion. Now, historically speaking, you have massive deficit spending at times of recession, at times of war, World War II being the quintessential example here. We are in neither of those things right now. We are now 3.5 years after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, and Joe Biden and this Congress are still spending like absolutely drunk sailors. The fiscal incontinence is totally through the roof. And, bear in mind, that number, that $2 trillion national deficit that we currently have in this country for fiscal year 2023, that would actually be even higher if the U.S. Supreme Court had not properly enjoined Joe Biden's unconstitutional unilateral action to, quote unquote, forgive student loans to the tune of $400 billion. So that number would actually be even higher. Overall, now that we are a few years into the Joe Biden presidency, the United States' debt to GDP ratio is over 123%. Now, going back to the Bush and Obama presidencies, for years and years, you had bipartisan economists from across the political spectrum basically saying that the point of no return, the danger point when it comes to debt to GDP ratio is 100%. Around this time, 2010, 2011 or so, you had some sovereign debt crises in Southern Europe affecting countries such as Greece and Italy. And at the time, all the discussion was about how 100% debt to GDP ratio was this terrible point that you cannot possibly get past. Well, under Joe Biden, we are now at 123% debt to GDP ratio. Folks, it really does not get a whole lot worse than that. And last year, lest we forget, what does Bidenomics actually mean? Well, 2022, perhaps of all years, really encapsulates that. The United States formally entered a recession in the year 2022. I think all this gaslighting, they really want you to forget that. But the first 2 quarters of the fiscal year last year saw negative 1.6% GDP growth roughly, and then negative 0.9% GDP growth roughly. Now, last I checked, when I studied economics back in the day, when I worked as an antitrust researcher, A recession was defined as consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. This was not a disputed thing. Every economist worth his or her salt, every political prognosticator, commentator, elected official, any candidate for office would tell you that it is the universally accepted definition of a recession to have consecutive quarters, 2 quarters in a row, of negative GDP growth. Having said that, last summer, we had multiple actors within the Biden administration, such as Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, and Brian Deese, the former top economist for the Biden administration, trying to tell us that, contrary to decades, if not centuries, of the universally accepted definition of what a recession is, actually means something a little different.
Well, we're certainly in a transition, and we are seeing slowing as we all would have expected. But I think if you look at the full data and the type of data that NBER looks at, virtually nothing signals that this period in the second quarter is recessionary.
There are many factors. Economic factors and indicators to consider. And I will say that the textbook definition of recession is not 2 negative quarters of GDP. Right now, we don't see a recession. Right now, we're not in a recession right now. Right now, we're in a transition.
Right, we're in a transition. Now, who are you going to take at their word for the definition of recession? What economists, PhDs, all the fancy degree people have been saying on this for decades and decades, uninterrupted and universally, unanimously? Or are you going to take the dim-witted White House press secretary who's trying to get her way out of a pickle? Tough choice. So yes, contrary to what they want you to believe with this got to work ad and all of their 2024 re-election campaign messaging, the United States entered a recession in 2022. That is not exactly a winning re-election campaign strategy, to say the least. But it actually gets worse than that. At the same time that we had back-to-back quarters of negative GDP growth, and contrary to the gaslighting you just heard, we did enter a formal recession. At that same time, inflation reached 40-year highs. We had the worst inflation in America in 2022 since the stagflation of the Jimmy Carter era of the late 1970s, which took heroic efforts from then President Ronald Reagan and then Fed Chairman Paul Volcker to tamp down. That was 40 years. Last summer, at its actual peak, inflation annualized on the CPI basis reached 9.1%. Again, that is a shocking figure. You know, for many years during the Obama presidency into the Trump presidency, all the chatter in Washington, D.C., as we saw these increasingly skyrocketing deficits, as we saw ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, starting with Fed Chair Ben Bernanke, continued into the subsequent Fed regimes. As all of that was taking place, the bipartisan chatter was, will the chickens come home to roost? Will the inflation finally come home to roost of this endless bipartisan uniparty spending like drunken sailors, this extended continuous Federal Reserve policy of zero interest rate? And the answer, it turns out, is yes. It took a little bit of time, but the answer, it turns out, was yes. We had horrible inflation last year. Gasoline prices last year, according to AAA, reached among the highest ever, the highest in the history of the recorded metrics of that particular figure. And inflation for certain items as well, certain kind of household staples, grocery staples, chicken, eggs. You know, the annualized inflation for a carton of eggs last year, again at its summertime, June or July 2022 peak, was up 32 to 33% on an annualized basis. I mean, you really can't make this stuff up. Wages, furthermore, have declined in real terms over the past 2.5, 3 years of the Biden presidency. Wages have not kept up with inflation. They have started to turn around over the past couple of months, but they have not even come close to turning around to compensate for the real wage declines that we saw for the first 2.5 years of the presidency. And of course, you know, we mentioned the price of gasoline. You really can't talk about Bidenomics without talking about this sweeping, sprawling across the entire spectrum, full throttle approach to the war on domestic energy, the war on fossil fuels. And you can't ignore the fact that Joe Biden, you know, he is so far removed from his working class Joe from Scranton. Oh, Uncle Joe. I mean, this is how this man for decades and decades presented himself as kind of a hardscrabble, relatable America from Appalachia. He is so far removed from that, and he is at this point, Joe Biden is at this point a pure cat's paw of green radical zealots and misanthropes. So let's take a bit of a look specifically when it comes to energy. So Joe Biden's very, very first day as president of the United States, if you want to go back to January 2021, he decides to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline, which was this purportedly controversial pipeline going up from the Alberta tar sands up in Calgary and Edmonton, going all the way down to oil refiners in Louisiana on the Gulf Coast. He decided to nix that on day one. Also, on day one of his presidency, Joe Biden put a leasing moratorium in place on the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, commonly known as ANWR. Now, speaking of ANWR, you might be wondering why ANWR sounds familiar. Well, that's because ANWR has recently been in the news. Well, it turns out that just last week, Joe Biden and his ham-fisted Department of the Interior put new limits on leases in ANWR. They revoked 7 leases in ANWR, 7 that the Trump administration put into effect on its way out the door in January 2021. They also moved to limit development on 13 million acres of the National Petroleum Reserve, which is kind of close to ANWR there in northern Alaska. So the net effect of this is just a massive, massive tamping down on drilling up in Alaska right now, canceling upwards of 40% of all federal leases in the National Petroleum Reserve. But it actually gets worse than that. There's actually a bit of a woke twist to this. If you want to know just how far off the reservation Biden and his Department of Interior have gone, if you listen to what his Department of Interior has said as to why they're cracking down on drilling in ANWR and the National Petroleum Reserve, they are citing among the various factors. I mean, they have the usual things. They're talking about how they didn't do a proper job of looking at carbon emissions and global warming, climate, all that stuff. They also cite indigenous knowledge. Now, recall, this is northern Alaska. There's a lot of American Indians and indigenous Alaskans up there in that part of the state. But when they quote indigenous knowledge here, it's literally exactly what it sounds like here. I mean, this is not the kind of thing that is quantifiable. It is floofy, and it is basically saying that we spoke to the tribes on the ground. They kind of maybe prefer to save the caribou or the moose or their fishing availabilities. They want to catch their salmon a little more easily, and we're just going to take them at their word, and therefore we're going to crack down on drilling. That is literally what the Biden administration is doing when it comes to oil and natural gas. And sure enough, it's very predictable. We're feeling the pain at the pump. So the average price of gasoline right now in America is a little over $3.80 a gallon. That number out west in the western U.S. is much higher than that. California, predictably, is the worst of all. The average price of gasoline in California now is well over $5.30 a gallon. Truly, truly galling stuff. At the end of the Trump administration, that number of the average price of gasoline nationally was roughly $2 to $2.50 or so. So we've gone up by 50 to 75% or so. I mean, this is not pretty stuff. At the same time, because the Biden administration has decided so much to crack down on our own hydrocarbons, on our own oil and natural gas that this country is blessed, yes, blessed, to sit atop, at the same time, he has been forced to go all around the world to grovel before hostile or at least not particularly friendly regimes to beg them for gas. So at the same time that Joe Biden is canceling the Keystone XL pipeline, the same time that he is canceling federal oil and natural gas leases throughout all of the United States, most recently up in ANWR and the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska, around the same time, he is going to places like Venezuela, Iran, Saudi Arabia, begging them to produce more oil. And as it turns out, because Joe Biden's foreign policy also stinks to high heaven, they're not listening to him. In fact, just last week, the Saudis and the Russians announced further oil production cuts for the rest of 2023. So you combine that with this cracking down on the drilling in ANWR and the National Petroleum Reserve, man, I mean, you're looking at potentially just absolutely massive spikes in gasoline prices for the rest of this calendar year. How about the housing crisis? Look, as someone who is on the housing market right now, I can tell you the housing market is an absolute atrocity. This is a terrible, terrible time to try to buy a house. Home prices have actually been rising despite the fact that Fed Chair Jerome Powell has been forced to raise interest rates to try to tamp down this ridiculous Biden inflation that again reached a peak of 9.1% on an annualized basis last summer. Home prices are still rising, despite the fact that Fed Chair Powell has raised interest rates, probably is going to have to continue raising interest rates over the course of the remainder of this year. And you know what's incredible is that the median mortgage payment for an American with a mortgage payment has actually more than doubled over the past 3 years, literally more than doubled. It was 14% of monthly household income. That was the median mortgage payment back in 2020. Earlier this summer, it reached 29%. So housing prices are increasing at the same time that mortgage payments are going through the roof. There was a historic supply chain crisis back in 2021. Many toddlers missed their Christmas gifts that year due to the absolute idiocy of Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of Indiana's fifth largest crime-ridden city, who doesn't know a damn thing in the world about how to run anything pertaining to transportation. At that time, you had ships off of the ocean that couldn't dock because there was a shortage of dock workers. There were truckers who were going on strike. A historic supply chain crisis, that also is what Bidenomics means. Americans currently have a personal savings rate. Americans aren't saving either. They have a savings rate of 3.50%. That is literally less than half the historical long-term average, which is well over 8, closer to 9%. Look, here's what it boils down to across the spectrum, from inflation to the war on energy, to the decline of real wages, to all of the above. Bidenomics, no matter what they tell you, is a war on the middle and working class. It is a class war. It is a war on those who disproportionately rely upon fossil fuels. It is a war on those who rely on fixed incomes, on retirees who are struggling to get by because they need a certain return on their investment. And with inflation the way that it is, interest rates, they are not able to get it. So Bidenomics has been a complete and utter catastrophe, no matter the ridiculous and obtuse lies that this administration tells you. Hey guys, Josh Hammer here. We've got a great special for you called Breaking Bidenomics. So the Biden re-election campaign is running on so-called Bidenomics more than virtually anything else, it seems, but they're trying to sell you a very, very different vision of Bidenomics compared to what our actual reality has been living through it for the past few years. We're going to break down what Bidenomics really is. We're going to be joined by some outstanding guests who will help break it down for you, from the inflation to the deficit spending, the war on energy, all of that. And you can go ahead and download the First TV app to watch Breaking Bidenomics for free.